So welcome everybody to this special session of the Walking Fellows Institute. We have Don Kostelec with us today to talk about the various standards that you might run into, how to look them up, how to understand them a little bit better. Cynthia is not going to be joining us today. She is in North Idaho for the Idaho Transportation Department August board meeting, which is up there, and was hoping to be able to duck out at this point, but they're in the middle of something she wanted to stay for. So she asked me to run this and record it. And of course, she'll review it so she can hear what all of you had to say about it. With that, I'm gonna let everyone just briefly introduce themselves so that Don knows who all is online and who he's talking to, and then I'll turn it over to Don. So Diane and Brenda, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Diane Hairston, Clearwater County Economic Development.
I'm Brenda Drobish, or if you know, Safe Routes to Schools, Biking in Clearwater.
Great. King, how about you?
Hi, I'm King West, City of Haley Street Department.
Wonderful. Joel?
Hello, my name is Joel Cater. I live in Haley. I'm a mechanical engineer and do product development. Thanks.
Great. Emily? Emily looks like she's connecting to audio right now. Kelly Schwartz, I didn't know you'd be with us, but why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Kelly Schwartz. I am the City of Haley Street Superintendent.
Oh, great. Thank you for joining us. That's wonderful. And Deanna, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody.
Deanna's with us. Emily is still connecting to audio. There you go. Emily, are you connected now? Can you hear us? If you want to introduce yourself, we've just done a round of introductions and then Don is going to start. Emily, are you there?
Hi, sorry. Yes, I couldn't connect. I'm Emily. I'm the Grants and Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Haley, and I'm excited to be here.
Great. I'm glad you got the audio working. Okay, I am going to turn it over to Don Kostelec. He's one of the principals of Vitruvian Planning. They do bicycle and pedestrian work all over the United States and have just a wealth of knowledge about this. I think Don is the person who knows the most about standards of all the people I know personally. So Don, take it away.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us, and good to see a couple familiar faces. It's been a few years since we've worked both up in Haley and Orofino, but certainly understand the challenges and what you're trying to do in your cities, and certainly applaud that as we need more of the small town examples in Idaho of this stuff, because even if we have the latest and greatest and best and most applicable thing here in Boise, that's not going to fly very far in some of our smaller communities. And so, yeah, I wanted to give this to you to give you an idea and understanding about what I think is a often misused term in terms of standard or standards when it comes to the design of our infrastructure and what that means for safety, and hopefully clarify that for you today. I'm going to turn off my video just so I can focus on this, so you're welcome to do the same. And we will go from there. So we'll start just kind of a provocative title: how standards slow down your safety effort. And it's a fact that among wealthy nations in the world, the United States is the leader in traffic deaths. And I would argue that that is by design. And we have for 30 or 40 years been applying a set of philosophies often defined as standards that under the guise of that's what's safest, or the standard is based on science. And the good thing is the National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Highway Administrations, and some of the more more, I would say, urbanized state departments of transportation around the country are starting to realize this. And I'd be lying if I said that I didn't feel Idaho was certainly behind on this, especially at the state level. So one of the things I think we lack is just a culture of safety. And this comes from a myth that we see perpetuated a lot, that 94% of traffic crashes are caused by human error. And that's simply not true. It's a misused statement of fact that finds its way into a lot of traffic safety campaigns. I've even seen it used as reasons to not upgrade an intersection to make it safer for pedestrians, because we want to say something like the pedestrian was wearing dark clothing or the driver was exceeding the speed limit. Well, that's making a lot of assumptions that doesn't look at a full culture of safety, to where we own safety and look at it as a way of life from the way we design, maintain, plan for, you name it, our street system. So that's what we're trying to change. And that's what this safety culture is meant to embody. And the science is starting to tell us this. Sweden, which has been a worldwide leader on Vision Zero and reducing traffic deaths, because they have realized, while humans may make mistakes, if we think we're going to perfect them, then we're fooling ourselves, because they found that deficiencies in the road traffic environment, as well as vehicle systems, are the main cause of approximately 63% of deaths. And when Sweden and the Netherlands adopted these design strategies that are different from the US in the 1970s, they've projected that if the US would have adopted it at the same time, our 45,000 traffic deaths a year would be cut in half. And that's what we're fighting and what we're up against. So I'm going to address this from two different sides, because I think when we hear highway engineering or traffic engineering, we can confuse them as two things. And I'm going to use these terms loosely, because I would say it in some ways they intermix. But when we talk about roadway engineering, I tend to think of that as kind of the physical aspects of that. When we look at this cross section of a road, the subsurface features, things that we can't see, the road base, the drainage, the utilities, all those things that go into that are very much kind of roadway engineering. Surface features such as the crown of the road, so it drains, how the asphalt is done, and how the concrete is done on a sidewalk, is roadway engineering, as well as our bridges and other structures. The traffic engineering side is markedly different. While this road may be 5 lanes and a roadway engineer is trying to make sure that those 5 lanes and everything stands up over time, it's oftentimes the traffic engineer or somebody giving input to that will give input to the number of lanes, or the width of those lanes, or the widths of sidewalks, or the widths of bike lanes, traffic signals, how signals are timed, how the road is striped, the number of lanes desired, the presence of streets and other street side features, as well as speed limits and design. And so these are two very different things to understand, because the guidance that's used and the policies that are used to guide the two do vary dramatically. In general, I will say this: the science related to traffic engineering is a lot less substantial than the science related to roadway engineering. And I think that's where we cause a lot of issues. And the reason I say that is when we look at the vertical and horizontal elements of a street, how it drains, the components of a bridge, the height of a traffic signal pole, those kind of things often in our world of trying to make things safer for pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorists, those aren't the kind of things we're really questioning. We're not questioning the railing height of a bridge or the bridge pier or the subsurface base of a roadway. Oftentimes what we're trying to make better is the traffic engineering side of that. Lane widths that are 12 feet that induce speed and are not compatible with urban or small town streets, or a turn radius at a corner that promotes high-speed vehicle turns and reduces the visibility of pedestrians. Those are the kind of traffic engineering decisions that I think we are most focused on. And certainly in things like a curb extension, a raised crosswalk, that's where we kind of get this traffic engineering feeding roadway engineering there. And I think where some of the confusion comes in. So if we look at Merriam-Webster's definition of standard, it's listed under there, and there's several definitions, but I pulled out two of them. One, a noun, standard, something set up, and this important part, established by authority as a rule for the measure, quantity, weight, extent, and value. An adjective of that is constituting or conforming to a standard, especially as established by law or custom. And I think when we get into discussions, especially with an agency like an ITD, this tends to be how they define that. And when an elected official hears we follow a standard, I don't believe that that elected official feels very empowered to question it. And I think this definition of standard and how it's applied by public agencies is used to kind of squash changes or public input or promote flexibility when ample flexibility is allowed. Definition B, that's also in the same dictionary of standard, something established by authority, custom, or general consent as a model or example, and something that might be regularly and widely used, available, or supplied. That, in my mind, is how we should look at things called standards when we do this. And it's a simple fact. Not one standard developed out of Washington, D.C. for the entire country can address every single situation, but we tend to apply them as if they are. So I'm going to start first of something you might hear. Hey, you know, we would really like a narrower travel lane and a curb extension. And you know what, we can deal with congestion for a couple hours a day because we'd rather promote pedestrian safety. And the excuse you might get is, well, we follow federal standards. We can't do that because the federal standards allow it. Here's a little secret. For the most part, there are no federal standards that dictate those things. FHWA has indeed adopted some federal standards for things like interstate highways, which for the most part, we're not concerned with. And they do have standards for the national highway system. So this is a national highway system map of Idaho. And you can see that Haley isn't on a national highway system route. So therefore, there is no federal standard that dictates anything in the physical roadway engineering of any street in Haley. Orofino, you're on US Highway 12. And while yes, that does have some authority there, your downtown and most of your city is not on that. And I'll address some of those issues here in a second. When they say the FHWA has adopted standards for these things, it's about very physical stuff. It's not as much about lane widths or sidewalks. Mainly says, and the reason I highlight accessible pedestrian design here, if you design a sidewalk, it must be ADA compliant, which really isn't anything unique to a national highway system route as much as it is, it's federal law and we have to do it anyway. This is what the Federal Highway Administration says. State and local agencies may consider designs that deviate from the federal national highway standards when warranted based on the conditions, context, and consequences of the proposed project. So in Orofino, where you're talking about a lower speed limit, more pedestrian crossings, there's nothing in the federal standards that prohibit that. And if an agency is trying to say federal standards are inflexible, the Federal Highway Administration says, no, it's very flexible. You just have to document why. And again, there are no federal standards for roadway engineering of local streets, which means we have all the flexibility in the world to use many different design guides to develop what we might adopt as our local standards, but there are no federal standards that tell locals how to design things. That was the roadway engineering side. From the traffic engineering side, it's slightly different. There is a document called the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, MUTCD. It is also oftentimes erroneously referred to as a federal standard, and I'll focus on that in a second. MUTCD does include standards and things that are labeled as standards and things that have the word shall, which is generally viewed as something that is compulsory unless you have good reason to deviate from it. What MUTCD does is it helps ensure things like a speed limit sign looks the same in Idaho as it does in Florida. It helps traffic engineers time traffic signals for at least a minimum standard for pedestrians. It does not prescribe a maximum standard for pedestrians. And when you look in MUTCD, the very first section says that it contains not only standards, but also guidance, options, and support. And only about 1/4 of what is in the 900 or so pages of MUTCD is actually a standard. The rest of it are things that allow ample flexibility to allow for local conditions and local context to prevail. MUTCD is adopted by reference in Idaho code. And so there is some legal standing for it. And it is something that local agencies, ITD, and others do have to follow, especially when it comes to those things labeled as standards. But again, you will often hear, we follow MUTCD standards. And as an advocate, I would say, which ones? Because there are plenty of other options and guidance that are not standards that do allow for this flexibility that you may seek. So on the roadway engineering side, sometimes you will also hear something like, we follow AASHTO standards. And generally what that comment is meant to do is reflect this document, a policy on geometric design of highways and streets, oftentimes called the Green Book. It is more than 1,000 pages, and it covers many, many facets, primarily focused on that element of roadway design that I mentioned, but it does incorporate some traffic engineering principles into it. And I'm going to cover what that is. So first of all, who is AASHTO? They're the National Organization of State DOTs. So the Idaho Transportation Department's executive director, by rule of AASHTO, has a seat on its board. Plus, engineers at ITD sit on AASHTO's numerous committees. They publish guidelines and research, including the Green Book I mentioned, but they also publish bicycle and pedestrian guides and something called Achieving Flexibility in Highway Design. They also do a lot of what's called materials testing to test like the substantiality of concrete and other things that are very important. But let's not also forget, AASHTO is a very powerful lobbying organization when it comes to federal policy, federal funding, and how federal projects are done. And don't underestimate the biases that are inherent in that. As I mentioned, ITD sits on that, and you can go in the front of any AASHTO guide. Unfortunately, you have to buy them, even though they are funded and developed with public monies, they are not available publicly. But I always highlight this because this AASHTO Green Book lists the Committee on Design and includes Idaho's chief transportation engineer, a guy by the name of Kevin Sablon. So everything in this book has been received, read, and commented upon by somebody at ITD, or at least they've had the opportunity to. A lot of people think that this Green Book was carried down from Mount Sinai by Moses and view it as it's inflexible. We follow the Green Book, and by God, if we don't follow the Green Book, people will die. There will be feast and famine and all kinds of other things. And I think a lot of this has led to what we would consider highway worship in a lot of ways. And what has happened is things inherent in the Green Book have been taken out of context or either pushed to extremes. And what happens is oftentimes a small city like that you're in will take what a state DOT adopts as their own and make it their own. Because let's say, you know, a city of even 25,000 is not probably going to go spend the money to develop their own set of policies and parameters around this. They're going to say something like, well, the state DOT is the transportation expert. Let's take what they have. And I think this goes back to the problem we have as we apply a lot of interstate and rural highway design philosophies to city streets. This is from a presentation by the American Public Works Association that says it better than I ever could. The Green Book is a policy on geometric design, not a standard. Standards are established elsewhere by other agencies. We should never refer to the Green Book as AASHTO standards, and we should never refer to the Green Book as safety standards. Again, that's not Don Kostelec talking, that's the American Public Works Association. So where do standards exist? As I said a couple times, state DOTs like ITD and cities like Haley and Orofino may adopt their own set of standards, which can at times be viewed as inflexible. But the great thing is, especially for a city, we can adjust and amend and adopt new ones at any time in a much easier process than even a state or a federal level. Many of these standards are based on AASHTO's guidance, but as I found in reviewing them, they're probably outdated, or they do things like use a maximum design value for travel lane widths. They will default to 12 feet on a travel lane width, but oftentimes default to the minimum width for a bike lane or a sidewalk. And this is why I oftentimes push back at ITD or other agencies when they say, well, we don't have any money, and that's why we're building the 5-foot sidewalk. Well, if money was truly the problem, and you have to build a minimum sidewalk, why are you not also building a minimum travel lane? Why are you not building minimums in other facets of the road? Why do pedestrians and bicyclists get relegated to the minimum while oftentimes they build the maximum for motorists? That's a bias, not a standard that we've applied through many of these things. It's also likely that the AASHTO bicyclist and pedestrian guides were not incorporated into a city or state DOT's design standards. And I'll give you an example of this later as it pertains to ITD. The AASHTO stuff is guidance because it has a range of values. There is no set of values. And that's why calling them standards is simply a misnomer. When we adopt local standards, we can change and adjust them to fit within the guidance and not go too far one way or the other. And what I like at this bottom is a policy manual statement from the Ada County Highway District here in Boise that in their policies do reference these AASHTO guides, but they are quick to say it's only guidance. And the agency reserves the discretion to deviate based upon unique circumstances of each project. And that's how it should be. It's not saying a value in there is necessarily good or bad, but there is ample flexibility and we can do a lot better job applying that. State DOTs, not even Idaho, misuse that term. This is a excerpt from a state DOT's design manual in another state where they say critical design elements not meeting AASHTO standards require an exception. And these critical design elements are, you can see there. That's a misuse of the term. In this city design manual, and this is a city I would hold up as one of the better ones from a pedestrian and bicyclist, they still erroneously use the term standards when applying to AASHTO elements when it's not. So don't think that Idaho is alone or unique. This is an industry challenge. So let's look at this based on what you've learned. ITD's Roadway Design Manual. Just Google that and you will find all 500 or so pages of it in all its glory. So tell me, all work performed on interstate pavement preservation projects must meet AASHTO standards, but other previously built areas of the roadway do not need to be brought to current standards. Is ITD correct in this instance using the term standards? Yes, they are, because the Federal Highway Administration has specific standards for interstate projects. However, there's also an entire manual on how agencies and like ITD can get design exceptions for the interstate highway system. So even what may appear to be written in stone is not written in stone. Elsewhere in the ITD Roadway Design Manual, roadway, and this is not pertaining to interstate highways, recommended roadway widths based on completed corridor plans or by applicable standards. The request for a width design exception to AASHTO standards cannot be solely based on this justification. This is an incorrect use of the term AASHTO standards because it is not in reference to an interstate highway or national highway system. It's reference in general. So if you're an ITD project engineer who doesn't get to design this manual and you're assigned to a project in Haley or Orofino and you see this, are you going to feel like you're empowered to be very flexible in addressing that? Probably not. And that's where the problems tend to lie. So let's go back to AASHTO. if we think of a standard as using the word shall, which makes it compulsory, which is consistent with what I said with MUTCD, I'm lucky enough that I have a PDF version of the AASHTO Green Book, and I can do a function and within about a minute search all 1,000 pages. And here's another little secret. The word shall does not appear anywhere in the 1,000 pages of the AASHTO Green Book, which is why calling this AASHTO standards is simply incorrect. So let's look at what the Green Book does say that can help us reach our goals. This policy is not intended to be a prescriptive design manual that supersedes engineering judgment by the knowledgeable design professional. A single book of 1,000 pages cannot dictate every circumstance on a street in the United States. Projects on existing roads particularly call for a flexible performance-based approach to design, and the policy encourages flexible design. And they even address and kind of admit that in the past, these things were applied too rigidly, and that the last sentence underlined, traditional applications of this policy took the approach that if the geometric design of the project met or exceeded specific criteria, it would likely perform well. Well, got news for you. Most of our highways have conformed to this in some form, and we still lead the wealthy nations of the world in traffic deaths. So have we accomplished our goals for safety by rigidly applying this? I say no, as does AASHTO. AASHTO had to go out because their own Green Book was seen as so inflexible and publish another 140-page guide to explain how the Green Book is indeed very flexible. And this is a quote from this flexibility guide. The Green Book is not intended and never was intended to be solely used as a standard which to base the design of every highway improvement. Sufficient flexibility is permitted to encourage independent designs. So here's where I'm going to bust some myths. We will hear often, we have to have 12-foot lane widths, and even seeing in some like LTAC presentations, leading participants to think that you need 12-foot lanes on your local residential streets. Maybe they'll be nice and give you 11, but they act like they're moving heaven and earth to do it. What does AASHTO say? AASHTO says the normal range is 9 to 12 feet. And for arterials like state highways through the middle of town, 10 and 12 foot lanes are appropriate. This is directly from AASHTO. There is less direct evidence of a safety benefit associated with incrementally wider lanes in urban areas. And values for lower speed urban street lane widths are less rigorously devised. That's AASHTO saying that for the most part, what we publish is meant for interstate highways and rural routes. They haven't historically addressed urban streets. So when somebody tries to say, well, if we go narrower than 12 feet, it's a safety problem on an interstate highway, on US 12 in between cities, yeah, I can see some of that, but that does not apply to your local urban streets. ITD's roadway design manual has some of this bias baked into it. For non-national highway system urban streets, they have this in there. Travel lanes, minimum feet 10, desirable feet 12. They don't call it maximum feet. So again, if you're the engineer assigned to a project in Orofino or Haley and you see this, if 12 is desirable, what is 10? It's undesirable, and you have to get an exception to do it. You'll also notice in this, there is nothing about what the best minimum or desirable width are for sidewalks and bike facilities. It's not even addressed in the same tables. And so if you're that design engineer picking this up, is that going to be your first consideration? Or are you going to consider bike lane presence and sidewalk presence and debate and determine how to best measure the trade-offs? Or are you going to just default to what's a 12-foot desirable? This one kind of cracks me up too, of 8-foot minimum, 10 desirable on parking lanes, which is both very excessive, especially for urban streets. Another one is level of service. Oh no, we can't do that for pedestrians or bicyclists because we have level of service standards to meet for drivers. And if you don't know level of service, it's basically an unfortunate grading system about traffic flow. And how many of you enjoyed going home to your parents and telling them you got an E or an F on a test? We didn't, right? And oftentimes this level of service F, which is forced flow and excessive delays, is unfortunately referred to as failing. and it is not. And we also hear that, hey, if I don't accommodate level of service, I could lose my engineering license. Not true. AASHTO says failure to achieve a level of service indicated by the Green Book does not constitute a non-standard design decision. Bring that home to ITD, and they have, again, non-national highway system stuff. In some cases, the recommended, not a standard, level of service becomes prohibitive and a lower level of service is acceptable. Justification must be documented. So how many times have you been in a meeting that they say, no, we can't do this, we can't do that? Well, go read their own state design manual and you'll find plenty of exceptions are allowed in that. Federal Highway Administration has also said, and is on the record, there is no federal mandate for level of service, and they do not have regulations that require specific minimum level of service for projects on the national highway system. So if Orofino, you're being told we can't do this for pedestrians because of vehicle level of service, there is no such standard that exists for that. ITD, to their credit, does have what's called a context sensitive solutions design manual. And I'm convinced that most of their staff don't even know it exists. They have goals in there to integrate the transportation system where we have, guess what? Modal choices beyond private vehicles, that we examine the economic, social, and environmental health of the state, and that we are flexible and must be open to options, opportunities, and community input as time passes. Just because State Highway 75 through Haley was built some way 30 years ago doesn't mean it still serves that function for the city today if we look at economic, social, and environmental health. Maybe it does, but let's explore that in many ways. And I know that's been a conversation, a very complex one. I'm not saying it's easy for that. Finally, a couple things on this, concerns over liability. Well, we'll get sued if we don't follow the standard. That's not entirely true. When you do get an exception to a standard, whether it's an MUTCD or anything else, the important thing is to document why it happened, because as all of the text I've shown you says, that's logical. When agencies get sued, it's not because they deviated from a standard, it's because they didn't document why they did it. So that's another important piece. So these guidebooks by AASHTO and stuff are all out there. Unfortunately, like I said, the AASHTO ones cost money, but there are other Federal Highway Administration endorsed guidelines like the ones on the bottom line that are free and you can get them in PDF. So now I want to address traffic engineering. So we'll move over to kind of the signals, the striping, the signs, things like that. So remember what I said, MUTCD is not a standard, but it includes standards. And this is the definition straight from the good book about that. Standard, a statement of required, mandatory, or specifically prohibitive practice regarding a traffic control device. Yep, if we ask for a deviation from a standard from an engineer, we can see why they're going to be reluctant to do that, and understandably so. But like I said, that's only about 1 in 4 statements related to this traffic engineering practice in MUTCD. Many statements in there are guidance. It's a recommended but not mandatory practice in typical situations, with deviations allowed if engineering judgment or study indicates it to be appropriate. Standard statements use the term shall. Guidance statements use the term should. That's very different in how it's interpreted. Unfortunately, my experience has found when MUTCD says something should be done and it relates to making something safer for pedestrians, it's unfortunately given too many traffic engineers the out clause to say, well, I don't have to do it and I'm not going to do it. And I think that's a cultural issue we're having to fight. In MUTCD are also options and support in other ways. And I'll give you an example of what that means in a second. Even within that, even within standards and federal endorsement and adoption in Idaho code, MUTCD still says this: the manual describes the application of traffic control devices, but shall not be a legal requirement for their installation. And while this manual provides standards, guidance, and options, this manual should not be considered a substitute for engineering judgment, which is meant to say there's flexibility for local conditions, and just document it when you deviate from them for very good reasons. So when we look at a section of MUTCD, and this is related to pedestrian push buttons and crossing the street, Under that is how this shows between standards, guidance, options, and support. And you'll see in the standard, this is where the term shall is used in terms of how to notify pedestrians to cross the street. An option is something like this, and you can see they use the term may. Guidance is if a leading pedestrian interval is used, it should be at least 3 seconds in duration. So it's giving guidance on what it should be, but the local conditions might necessitate something longer. Maybe you think it can be a second shorter. I don't know, but you have that option to go on. So let's look at a typical traffic signal. Hey, we want to signal in Orofino or Haley to help pedestrians get across the street. A typical traffic signal that we all know with the red, yellow, green lights is something that is very heavily regulated with lots of standard statements in MUTCD. Traffic signals require something very stringent in order to justify their installation, and that is called a warrant. And so certainly you can see here under the standard, shall be considered. And to justify a dedicated traffic signal only for pedestrians, this isn't talking about a traffic signal at an intersection of two streets, you've got to meet some pretty high criteria, something on the order of like 120 pedestrians an hour. And where in Orofino are you really going to find that, right? So if we go to ITD and say, well, we want a pedestrian signal out here, and they might just come back to you and say, well, it doesn't meet a warrant. And you know what? They're probably right. But what if you ask them, we want a safer crossing treatment for pedestrians across US Highway 12 in Orofino? That's a very different question, because we have something like a pedestrian hybrid beacon or a hawk signal. The word warrant is never used for this type of signal. And that means you don't have to meet the thresholds in their guidance table on pedestrian crossings. And this even says that under option 2, a pedestrian hybrid beacon may be considered for installation at a location that does not meet the traffic signal warrant that I showed you in the previous one. And the only place this says a standard related to that is they shall be used in conjunction with signs and pavement markings and shall only be installed at a marked crosswalk. That doesn't mean a pre-existing crosswalk. That means if you put one of these in, you also have to mark a crosswalk that's there. Things like rapid flash beacons, and I know you guys had this issue in Orofino at the end of your pathway where an ITD board member was told that there aren't enough cars or something. There are no rules for that. That is 100% the judgment of the engineer in doing that. There is no set threshold of pedestrian crossings, vehicles, speeds, or anything else for that. And so go back. Do you want a signal for pedestrians, a traffic signal on Highway 12 or Highway 75, or do you want a safer crossing? And depending on how you ask the question means the different things we can explore here. A couple other myths, speed limits. And I know in LTAC's training, they only teach it as if the 85th percentile, a mark at which 85% of vehicles are traveling at or below is how to set the safest speed limit. Not true. The 85th percentile is only mentioned as an option, not a standard. And it's not about setting speed limits. It's on a section on speed limit signs in MUTCD. And I'm not going to belabor this a ton, but the National Transportation Safety Board looked into this because using this 85th percentile to set speeds in urban areas is a big contributor to our pedestrian and bicyclist death rates. It was developed on urban highways in the 1950s, and pedestrians, bicyclists, and other things were never a part of it. And even the National Transportation Safety Board says it is dated research and may not be valid under scrutiny. So I ask you this, if the National Transportation Safety Board, which you probably know mostly from investigating airplane crashes, came out and said that the things that occurred for this particular commercial airliner that crashed and killed a lot of people, what we applied is not based on research and may not be valid under scrutiny. Would you fly that airline if they said, no, we disagree with NTSB, we're going to keep doing it? And that's what's happening in the highway engineering industry right now. This caused a lot of consternation because we've been so ingrained that this metric is what's used for safety, and it's not. Some other things in this report are there. I won't belabor it, but NTSB recommends the removal of even guidance in MUTCD on the speed limit being within 5 miles of 80%, and stresses the use of things like what's called US Limits 2 that indicates engineers can use a 50th percentile or the average speed when pedestrian and bicyclist safety is a factor. We have the flexibility for that. 85th percentile is not a standard, but it's used as one. So one final real world example to tie these things together that I think you might be able to apply in your situation. We want to get a safer pedestrian crossing with some type of signal other than just a marked crosswalk across a 5-lane road. In this example, I'll use Chinden here in Boise because we've used this a lot. Most people, if this woman got hit, would say, well, she's jaywalking, when in fact, under Idaho law, she's legally in a crosswalk. It just happens to be unmarked. But if we expect everybody to obey the law to keep pedestrians from getting killed, going back to my culture of safety, we will all fail, right? So we have a neighborhood, and you can see it on the top here with the trees. And we have a grocery store right across this highway called Chinden. We have 1.15 miles between two adjacent traffic signals that have walk signals. There are no other marked crosswalks or any other type of protection or indication of pedestrians in that entire 1.15 mile stretch. Now, out on US Highway 12 between Lewiston and Orofino, that's probably fine, but this is an urban area, and you can see the land uses here are plenty that would justify considering that. And we often hear, well, just go to the nearest crosswalk, you pedestrians. Just walk down to those signals. They're there for your safety. So let's take a look at that. As the crow flies, if I want somebody to take this walk to go from this neighborhood to the grocery store, it's only about a 4.5 minute walk to get there. That's what I think most people would do. But what does the highway and traffic engineering of our street ask us to do? They ask us to go 1.05 miles just to cross a street to get to that. And that's somehow a valid expectation in the world of engineering. And oh, by the way, not only are we asking people to walk 20 minutes one way just to cross a street, when we do that, we are putting pedestrians in 21 additional driveway and street conflicts. We have things like flashing yellow arrows that will give a flashing yellow arrow that allows a motorist to shoot the gap in traffic, all while a pedestrian has the right of way. And we've had deaths in this state because of that. And we might make pedestrians wait up to 3 minutes at that nearest signal. So we could have a 25-minute walk one way, depending on how we hit that light. And our risk is a lot greater. So you might get a response that says, well, we can't put a crossing where you want it. It doesn't meet a standard. And hopefully from what you've learned, there is no such standard and there are plenty of options. Here's another little secret. When all you hear is level of service for motorists, the Federal Highway Administration also publishes level of service for pedestrians. And if you look at the bottom of this, level of service E or F, which we would deem unacceptable or failing for cars, the moment a pedestrian is forced to either wait 60 seconds to cross at a signal, or some would say walk that 20 minutes out of their way, the likelihood of them not complying with what we're asking them to do is high or very high. So if we don't accept level of service F for motorists, why do we routinely accept level of service F for pedestrians? So now let's get into the AASHTO pedestrian guide to bring this home. It was just published in December of 2021. And I will say this, it's fantastic. There's wonderful stuff in there. And oh, by the way, it's also signed, endorsed, and reviewed by ITD. So they can't claim they don't know what's in it. Here's what AASHTO says about this hypothetical crossing we're talking about. The environment should induce drivers to travel at low speeds. Wow, that points directly to engineering. It doesn't say speed should be based on the 85th percentile. Generators and destinations. Pedestrians will not typically go out of their way to cross the street at another location unless that location provides a safer opportunity and is reasonably close. And this is the one I love, frequency. Unlike motor vehicles, pedestrians cannot, that's a pretty strong word, be expected to go more than a half block out of their way, about 300 feet in urban areas, to take advantage of a controlled intersection. And by controlled, that might mean a four-way stop, a rapid flash beacon, a pedestrian hybrid beacon. This is not Don Kostelec talking. This is AASHTO. Many view this as the standard, even though it's not. But when you hear AASHTO talked about as a standard for cars, it also says wonderful things about pedestrians that never get applied so sacredly as what AASHTO says oftentimes for cars. Mid-block crossings. Pedestrians have a strong desire to cross streets at locations close to their intended path. Whoa, mind blown, right? And we should look at this where spacing between adjacent signalized intersections exceeds 500 feet. In that Chinden example I gave you, it's 1.15 miles. There's clearly justification within AASHTO. We don't need signal warrants for a full pedestrian signal. We can do a pedestrian hybrid beacon. So please don't hide behind standards when trying to deny our request for a safer crossing. Pedestrian hybrid beacon, it repeats, traffic signal warrants do not have to be met. So let's ask yourself, what's the driving equivalent? Pedestrians, just go to the nearest signal. It's okay that you have to walk 20 minutes out of your way just to cross a street. Would we ever make a driver go 4.8 miles and 20 minutes out of their way to make a U-turn and cross a street? Oh, heck no, that wouldn't meet these mythical standards that are out there. But this is what we ask pedestrians to do all the time. And in the end, we blame them if they cross there, and we blame them even more if they get hit, even though the engineering is what prompted it. And we have ample flexibility in our federal design guides to accommodate that safer movement. So what can you do? Advocates and citizens, fundraise to buy copies of these guides for yourselves and cities. Have your library get a copy of these guides for their reference desk so you can go look at them. City planners and engineers, get copies of these guides and understand the full breadth and depth of what they contain. Don't rely on ITD standards and use engineering judgment for the good of everyone. Just document and justify why you made the decision, and there is no threat to your license and to your city's liability. For metropolitan planning organizations, neither of you have those, but Twin Falls, for example, is getting one. Lewiston has one. They can adopt planning goals that incorporate references to these design guides and make sure that agencies that are submitting projects base them on that. That is well within their authority. And for state DOTs, be flexible. We hear it, we read it, but I would say we've all experienced very recently inflexibility in trying to achieve these types of things. So a couple of recaps. Just because a street or intersection or pedestrian crossing, quote, meets a standard, that doesn't mean it's safe. Standards really only work to shield an agency or an engineering entity from liability. That's where the difference is. And deviation from the standards is allowed and supported to address local need or context. We just need to document it, and agency leaders need to empower their employees and their consultants to do it at the same time. So with that, I will certainly stand for any questions.
Well, thank you, Don. Streaking from a fire hose for even me, so I'm
Yes.
for other folks. But
that's why it's being recorded. You can go back and digest it, I guess.
It is recorded, and we will also get Don's PowerPoint and share with you so you can read some of the language on those. If you guys want to turn your cameras on, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, if anyone has any. Joel, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering if it seems like stop signs would be effective in improving bike and pedestrian crossings of streets. I'm wondering, one, would you agree? And then two, are there any standards or guidelines in terms of when to place like a four-way stop?
Yeah, there are general guidance on the topic, and four-way stops and stop signs can be heavily nuanced based on condition. I think the real concern there is if you put in a four-way stop and you don't have things like more balanced traffic on those streets, you will get drivers not adhering to them. And I've sought for years to find the studies that came out of Europe that actually showed drivers were more cautious at a four-way yield intersection than a four-way stop. For whatever reason, psychologically, that seems to prompt oh, yield, I better look around and make sure something's not coming in my way, versus the stop, where if you have a four-way stop and you go through it all the time and you're used to nobody being on the side streets, there's a tendency there to get at that. So I think four-way stops need to be used wisely. I think if used in combination with things like curb extensions and raised crosswalks, or doing those things when the engineering judgment may not seem to suggest a four-way stop, is likely to be a more impactful treatment for that.
Great question.
Yeah.
Others? Brenda, you have one?
Yeah, I have a question. So are there standards or standards? Anyway, are there
See?
guidances or recommendations on bike lanes?
There is ample guidance on bike lanes. The Federal Highway Administration Bikeway Selection Guide that I showed is one of the free ones. If you Google that, it is published in 2018, and it has a great matrix in it that shows the speed of a road and the traffic volumes of a road, and it uses a function of those to suggest the most context appropriate bike facility. So for example, any road over 35 miles an hour, the research is telling us a standard bike lane doesn't provide the safety that is necessary. It tells us that about anything over, I think about 4,000 vehicles a day also prompts that. And that's a hard one, because I look at it of, if you have a road that has those characteristics, but it's in an existing city, so the concept of building a separate pathway or a protected bike lane is not there. I think the design response should be to put features in the road that self-enforce the desired speeds, that make, say, a road with 7,000 vehicles a day that would justify a protected lane. How do we get the speeds down to 25 miles an hour? So less confident bicyclists and families should be in there. And then within those different types, in general, a bike lane should be 5 feet in width. The biggest mistake I see made is that where the asphalt transitions to concrete in the gutter cannot be used for width of a bike lane. And that's used very often to say that it is, and I have plenty of, the gutter isn't used to calculate a motor vehicle travel lane width. So why do we use it to justify a bike lane width?
How about bike lanes in the center of the road versus on the right or the left side? Is there?
Ooh, that's a very interesting one. I think as the science and the design guides are evolving on kind of these separated bike facilities, and the biggest example I know of a bike facility down the middle is like Pennsylvania Avenue in DC. And I know that's a very extreme environment, but in a situation like that, where they have frequent traffic signals, a bicyclist traveling down the middle that has plenty of options to turn and maneuver and reach their destinations, those can be made appropriate. If we don't have that, it forces a bicyclist perhaps to travel in an undesirable location or an undesirable direction. I'll see a lot of roads with bike lanes that have medians and don't have any access for a mile or so, and you kind of end up forcing the bicyclist to either use the sidewalk or go the wrong direction in the bike lane, because if their destination is at a certain place and they can't get there because they can't access it or turn, what else are they left to do?
What about in a small town residential place where you don't have a high volume, just
Sure.
Elaine, I'm talking like Brown Avenue, or we want to put those signs, we want to put those charros in there, but and we need to go mark them because we're going to plan on doing that, but
Yeah.
where do we do that at?
So there's another guide I forgot to mention that I think and I should send you, Diane, the report we did on Orofino a few years ago, because I think we referenced it. It's the Federal Highway Administration Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide. And it gets at these type of options for the street you're describing in terms of why just painting sharrows might not be enough, or what some other treatments are to maybe do what's called a bicycle boulevard along a street like that. And a lot of that is geared toward not just expecting paint to solve the issue if other road design features are prompting higher speeds by the motorist that make that uncomfortable. And I don't know the characteristic of that particular street, but that's what I would recommend, is look in the Multimodal Networks Guide. And the great thing about that is it's endorsed by the Federal Highway Administration, so it should give you some confidence to apply that. It also has tables in it that talk about the speed and volumes of roads in terms of the appropriate context.
Brenda and Don, I think important for you to know, they're talking about a road that we walked with them last week or 2 weeks ago when we were there, and we were recommending, and I know it was a lot of information for you guys to take in, Brenda, but we talked about treating that whole road as a bikeway, which is kind of what Don is talking about when a lot of people call them bike boulevards. It's just that you've identified that as a bike priority corridor, even though, and it's a low volume street. And then we identified those 3 segments because it is today engineered so uniquely in those 3 segments. So there's a section there, Don, where we recommended just sharrows because it's a real local, low volume, has detached sidewalks. There's another section that is needs advisory bike lanes because there's just not enough cross section. And then there is a section where we think they could put in bike lanes in both directions. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you guys remember, but I talked a lot about the need for signage, not just the paint, but signage and education for the community to understand what a bikeway is, and that these various new paints that they're going to see on the ground are about improving the safety and accommodating those people cycling, and that drivers are there as a lower priority, frankly. I don't know how else to put it. So I just wanted to provide that background for you, Don, and in this conversation.
Well, and here's the example of that rural design guide that I talked about. You can get it in PDF form for free. It's kind of the physical one, but this one gets at, say mixed traffic and has some cut sheets. Here's this preferred and potential volume and operating speed, the types of streets, examples of that, benefits, other things that can be there. This graphic to me is one that just kind of shows, unless you already have characteristics like you described, Deanna, that are already keeping the traffic at a slower speed, you might need to incorporate other things. And I know Orofino's streets are pretty tight. If I go to Haley's streets, they're pretty wide, and without other treatments, I would have that fear of it. So this is kind of like the full suite of things that can be considered. But I think if you guys, it sounds like contextually, you've identified some of the right treatments for those based on some of those characteristics already.
So that also shows the traffic circle that we talked about. We did talk about potentially using traffic circles, not full roundabouts. I did put the link to that in the chat, also the link to the FHWA bicycle selection document. So hopefully everyone can find that. We are at the end of our time. I would love to keep going, but I actually have another appointment, so I'm going to have to end it anyway. We try to keep on time with these. Yeah. If there are other questions that you didn't get to ask, if you'll email them to Cynthia and I, we'll try to get answers for you and get back to you with those answers. Thank you, everyone, for
Yeah, thank you.
participating. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Yeah, it was really good. Thank you.
You bet.
Bye.